Hello, colleagues. Let's think together about the expectations around the case study. So the purpose of the case study is really to look deeply at a student and be able to think about balancing data to really come up with some instructional goals for a student and be able to use multiple data points and a balance of assessments to support instruction for a student. So many times in our classrooms, we have data points, but we often don't have time to really look deeply at a student. So this is our opportunity to be able to do that with our case study. So let me just give you a quick overview on the expectations. So on Blackboard this week, you will find this annotated outline of the case study. So you will be going into the case study, this particular form, and you will be putting your students' information in here. So I want to caution you to be able to fill this out. I don't want you to put any information that really identifies a school or a particular student or a family. So you will probably use a first name, or sometimes people even make up a first name to use, and then you will list your name, and then even parents' names, just a first name, or sometimes made up names. You can put in a fictional a school name. So it's important to have a rough birth date, though, in case there's questions around a student's performance within their age. So sometimes students are developmentally young because they might have had an August birthday, so that can sometimes come into play, especially for some of our youngest learners. Sometimes they just need a little bit more time and a little bit more instruction. So that's important that we put that. And you really don't want any identifiable markers with the district. So remember that as we're moving forward. So typically in a special ed meeting, or you'll see this type of a summary write-up of a particular student, and they'll oftentimes list a reason for a referral. So this is something you can choose to add, or you can omit this part if you choose to. Many students will just write in here that they are doing this for the purposes of a graduate course, or sometimes they'll even just delete it. So, but if you were writing this up for your school or district, you might write about either parents requested this, deep diagnostic look at their student. Obviously, we are not able to diagnose students as reading specialists or educators. Only the school psychologist has the capacity to be able to do that. But this is still a diagnostic look at a particular student. The next thing you're going to want to include, and you will omit this, so you'll sort of delete this. So these are just annotations for you, things that I thought would be helpful for you to include. So you may or may not know some of this information. So do not feel like you need to list all of these. But some people have more information than others, and sometimes it's really helpful to include more information rather than less information. And so if there's any type of developmental history, if the student has something significant that would impact their educational history, it's important that we really just kind of give some background information. If it seems like the student is receiving special education services, if the student's been retained to grade level, if the student has some other type of social emotional issues. Sometimes it's important that we just talk about that student. And other times, graduate students use this place to really put information in around the student's engagement with literacy. So the interview that you had with your student, do they like to read? What are some of their favorite books? Do they like to write? What kinds of stories do they like to write? Certain things that they like to do, certain interests that they have, all of that information can go here. So it's very open-ended what can go here. Typically, it's a paragraph or two. It's not very long. It's just sort of, how do we get to know this student so we can make a connection just beyond the data? And as we're thinking about their instructional plan, this is a place we could go back to be able to think about what type of text might this student connect with, or what type of text might we want to avoid, because sometimes if a student has some type of social emotional issues, we want to avoid things that may trigger behaviors. So this is your place to sort of let us identify with who your student is. In observations, this is things you may know about the student in the classroom, because, or may not, we're really trying to get a picture of the whole child, not just the data, because this is a deep look within a lens into the student's performance. We want to think about, what else do we know about the child and what are we noticing about them? So in some instances, if you were in school and this student was either in your classroom or in the classroom next door, you might observe how that student is interacting within the context of their learning. You may not have that opportunity at this point, but you may include some other information. So as you are working with the student or interviewing the student or assessing the student, what did you notice about them? Did they seem relaxed? Did they seem hesitant to respond? Did they seem very confident? Did they want to avoid tasks when it got difficult? So whatever types of observations that you have, you might want to list them here. And you'll want to always remember that this may be shared within a team meeting. So even though it's confidential, you'll want to be very careful in the way you sort of word information so that you're sort of politically correct as you're really making notes and observations about the students, so that it really presents a positive lens on the student, even though you might be saying, they need frequent breaks rather than they couldn't focus on the task, right? So those are some things that I want to caution you about within this area. You might also, and this may not exist, you might also know of some previous assessments. So if you have additional data on the student, an outside evaluation, you might have standardized assessment scores, or you might be doing this with your student that's in your classroom. So you might have some previous data on that student, and so you might want to list them here so that it shows that there's some foundational assessment information you had moving forward. So the next thing you'll want to do is really, this section is just a list of assessments that you gave. So you're not doing anything other than list all of the assessments, both formal and informal, that you gave. So the list of assessments will be here with your, right after that information. Next, there's some examples in here. So you're going to omit all of the data that is here, right? And you're going to add your own data, right? So the summary of assessment results. So in this portion, right, you're going to say how the student did, and you're just going to list scores. So after you list what assessments you gave, then you'll just list the outcome of scores, right? You won't write anything up about it. You're just sort of creating some type of visual information. Some people will choose to even use a visual or draw a visual. Sometimes they'll create a bar graph, right? So you might say, if it's, let's just say letter identification, you might create a graph and show that 93% is high. And then word identification, you might put 7% that's low. So you might have a scale here. so that as we're reading this data and this information, visually it may pop out to us. So that's a choice, that's up to you. I think the visual display is really impactful for the reader, so anybody looking at this data really can notice the student's strengths and weaknesses right off the bat in certain areas. So this is actually scores from this particular assessment. This is scores from another assessment. These are just examples, annotations for you. I will show you another exemplar when it's filled out. And then list any additional results. So these aren't all the assessments that were given. These are just examples for you to be able to see. So next, you're going to put a summary of the assessments. This is when you're going to talk about this data. You're going to explain it in a narrative form. So you're going to describe the test and the format of the assessment. So what was the purpose of that assessment? That's really important. So what is this? Like, how is it structured? Is it a checklist? Do they read something and answer questions? Is it multiple choice? So you're going to tell something, 1 or 2 sentences about the assessment itself, so that when people are reading this data, they sort of have an understanding of what this test is, what's it for, and how is it structured. And then it's really a synthesis of the information, but remember, as you're writing it up, you're really going to think about the data and you're going to use examples from the data, not just scores. So you'll want to say exactly if there were 1 or 2 things that stood out to you that showed the student really did well on something, or really, it was challenging for them. You're going to want to make anecdotal notes, and you're going to include that information in this section. So each test is sort of a narrative, but then there's some data around that student, and it's interwoven. It's sort of when you write a lit essay and you include evidence and then explain that evidence. So this is sort of what you're doing with the data that you've collected, so that we can get a clear picture, not just have this quantitative data repeated, but really you're explaining it in the structure here. So this will be quite lengthy. And then after this very lengthy section, so this is very deceiving, right? And when I show you the exemplar, you'll be able to see that. And then you'll come up with some instructional goals that are supported through this data. And you'll want to be sure that you only have 2 to 3 instructional goals. So it might be helpful that you use the strategies. It might be helpful that you think about some of the goals within what strategies do good readers use. Or another helpful resource is goals found in Jennifer Saravallo's Reading Strategies book. So you can actually look at her section where she talks about goals, and you might then add those goals to your section and explain them. So as we think about this case study, I want to share with you one sample of how a student took this template and made it their own. So there is some choice around how you can structure this information. So I have students who have had colorful displays. I've had students who've had happy, sad faces around different areas of literacy, or straight faces where they sort of scored in the 50th percentile. So some of the visual displays are choices, or up to you how you present. I'm just going to show you one example, and then you'll be able to choose other ways that you may structure it based on your particular needs. So if we look at this particular template, you'll notice I tried to white out some of the information, so some of it's covered. You'll notice that this student still followed the same format, but it's not exact. So she sort of omitted some lines, right? So this was about a kindergarten student, right? So we have reason for referral here, right? So she talked about, Aiden requires one-to-one support throughout his daily academic routine, right? So talking about the beginning of the year, how he had trouble following directions in the classroom in kindergarten, right? So she really just sort of talked about the student in the context of his environment and any information that she had about him. You may or may not have this. So you may have a very short section around saying something about how you completed this for a graduate course during the time of COVID-19, and that this was conducted through video observations, or you might have other information to put down. So anything you choose to add here or omit, it's completely up to you, but it's a place for you to sort of add information. Then she included background information about him, right? How old he is, who lives at his house with him, right? So these are some of the information that you may have collected during your interview with the student. And then notice how the observations, right? So she obviously knew this student very well, right? So if we're thinking about observations, here it is on our case study. Look at how short it is, but then she definitely has expanded around that information. So sometimes students have a lot of information. Sometimes they write things like, seemed to maintain their focus for the first 20 minutes. Then we took a break and changed activities, right? So those types of conversations, or resisted the written portion of the assessment, or disliked this, or engaged more with that. So any type of observations that you have are completely appropriate. Then you can see previous test information, right? So it said she wasn't working in the school earlier this year and was not able to collect any previous testing in regards to, right? So she was able to gain a lot of knowledge from some of his teachers, right? But she might not have put that end sentence. So that's completely up to you. Here's her list of assessments that she administered. So for this kindergartner, she gave the Fountas and Pinnell Benchmark Assessment System. She gave WordWorks Foundation Units Assessment. She gave the Observation Survey. She gave an end-of-the-year benchmark assessment for kindergarten. And end-of-the-year work was also collected, so authentic samples of student work. So it could have been writing, right? Anything that she chose. So that is right here with assessments administered. Next, she chose to take her summary of results. So in your template, you can see that the summary of results was just a listing of scores, where she really sort of collected what assessment she gave, an Ohio word list. The student read 6 out of 20 correct. These are the words that he misread. These are words that he skipped. And this is sort of that stay-9 score that he has. So she chose to put it in a grid. You do not have to do this. You can simply list. You can put them in columns. Any way you choose to display this is totally up to you. So here is her sort of summary of results. And it goes on. And then she starts to talk about each assessment. So I would have preferred some type of sentence or introductory on how the assessment was structured, or how, what the students had to do during the assessment, and then what the teacher had to do. So here she included some of the work. And so that continues for each particular assessment. And then she selected some specific goals, actually lessons that she would give after her summary. Let me just go back to that part. So after she sort of identified how he did, she kind of included like what work he needed to do in each of her assessments. And then she put in her recommendations for the instruction that she would give the students. So she actually went in and selected particular lessons that she would apply. I would have had her actually target the goals for students in student-friendly language. So this is an example. It's not an exemplar. It's not perfect. She obviously did an excellent job, and she had the flexibility, right? So she still has a lot of, if she were to share this out in a school environment, she has a lot of examples of what this instruction would look like. As the reading specialist, she might even share out or support with professional development, how to engage students within this work. So think about how you might balance this work in your case study. So you might talk a little bit about a goal. You might put that goal in student-friendly language. So a student says, I'm rereading to make my reading more smooth and sound like talking so that I can understand. So that could be the goal. So when you say to your student, so what are you working on as a reader? Right? They're able to say something to you, and then you're able to say, so how's that going? Did you try that? Did you show me where you did that? And then you can continue to impact and adjust your instruction and take those anecdotal notes and that formative data while you're working with the student. And then finally, you'll notice that she included at the end the raw data. So she has in the back of her case study. So obviously you'll be doing this digitally. Many teachers just scan their data and they just put it in a folder, and that's how they turn the work in. Sometimes you can take a picture of the work and add the pictures to the end of your case study. And sometimes it'll just be across 2 pages because you formatted the pictures to be able to show the data within each graphic organizer, however you want to present the data. So there are some choices around this. I did want to show you at least one example of what this looks like. And when I meet with you, I will share with you another example. So you may choose to ask questions or email me if you feel like you need further conversation. We'll continue to talk about this for the next few weeks because this will be our final assignment. Our final project in this course is the case study. So all the work that you'll do throughout the course are really leading up to this. So you might engage with just this beginning part because you've already interviewed the student or have information about the student, and then start adding information as you go along. One part, the week before they'll be turned in, you'll be posting them to the discussion board and getting some feedback from your peers so that if there are any revisions or things that people want to know more about or more information around, or it could be just in draft form and people are giving you some suggestions so that you have an opportunity to see other people's case studies in case you want to shift or add information.